The church bells of Pine Ridge had fallen silent an hour ago, but Clara Watson still stood on the weathered wooden steps in her ivory silk wedding dress, watching the dust settle where Roland Blackwood's horse had disappeared down the main street. The August sun hung low over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Under circumstances where she wasn't a 28-year-old spinster who'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man who'd just robbed her of her last $50 and fled like a coward. The townspeople of Pine Ridge had long since retreated to their homes and businesses, their initial curiosity about the abandoned bride giving way to the uncomfortable silence that accompanies public humiliation. Clara could feel their eyes peering through curtained windows, could almost hear the whispered conversations about the foolish Eastern woman who'd been taken for a mark by a smooth-talking confidence man. Her hands trembled as she clutched the bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked that morning, back when she'd still believed Roland's letters about establishing a freight business in the booming railroad town. Back when she'd imagined herself as the respectable wife of a prosperous businessman, helping to build something meaningful in the Colorado Territory. The marriage certificate, signed only by her and the nervous young preacher, rustled in the evening breeze that carried the scent of pine and the distant promise of autumn. Reverend Matthews had mumbled his apologies and retreated to his parsonage, leaving Clara to face the reality of her situation alone. She had no money for return passage to Philadelphia, no family who would welcome her back after the scandal of her failed engagement to Roland had already tarnished her reputation. No prospects for employment in a frontier town that measured a woman's worth by her husband's success or her father's standing. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through her bitter reflections. A single rider emerged from the tree line that bordered the town's eastern edge, leading a pack mule loaded with what appeared to be the season's hunt. Clara's first impression was of someone who belonged entirely to the wilderness. Weathered leather chaps, a wide-brimmed hat that had seen hard use, in the easy posture of a man more comfortable in the saddle than on foot. As he drew closer, Clara could make out more details. He was perhaps 35 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat and gray eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing anything of his thoughts. His face was tanned from years of mountain sun, and his hands on the reins showed the calluses and scars of someone who worked with tools and weapons. The rider brought his horse to a stop near the church steps and sat quietly for a moment, studying Clara with an expression she couldn't read. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the roughness of someone unaccustomed to regular conversation. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "seems like you might be in some difficulty." Clara straightened her spine, determined to maintain what dignity she could manage. "Thank you for your concern, sir, but I'm quite capable of managing my own affairs." The stranger dismounted with fluid grace and secured his horse's reins to the hitching post outside the church. Up close, Clara could see that his clothes, while well worn, were of good quality. His boots were expensive leather, and the rifle secured to his saddle was the kind of precision instrument that cost more than most men earned in a year. "Name's Jake," he said simply. "Jake Steele. And I'd wager you're the bride that fellow was supposed to meet on today's train from Denver." Clara's cheeks burned with renewed embarrassment. News travels quickly in small towns, especially when it involves a man taking the afternoon stage out with someone else's money, Jake replied. His gray eyes held no judgment, only a quiet understanding that somehow made Clara's humiliation easier to bear. "You know about Roland?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded grimly. "Saw him at the depot, counting bills and looking pleased with himself. Takes a particular kind of coward to steal from a woman who trusted him." For the first time since Roland's betrayal, Clara felt something besides shame, a spark of anger that warmed her from the inside. "Indeed it does." Jake was quiet for a moment, his gaze taking in Clara's abandoned state and the growing shadows of evening. When he spoke again, his words carried a gravity that made her heart skip unexpectedly. "I don't remember women being this beautiful," he said quietly, and something in his voice made the simple statement sound like a revelation rather than flattery. Clara looked up at him sharply, searching his weathered face for signs of mockery or calculation. Instead, she found only honesty and something that might have been wonder. Ma'am, Jake continued, removing his hat and holding it against his chest, I know this is irregular, and I'm not much for fancy words or proper courtship, but if you're willing, I'd be honored to offer you my name and whatever protection I can provide. The proposal hung in the evening air, like smoke from a distant fire. Clara stared at this stranger who'd appeared from the mountains like something from a frontier legend, offering salvation when she'd expected only judgment. You don't know anything about me, she whispered. I know you had the courage to travel 2,000 miles for a new beginning, Jake replied steadily. I know you're standing here with dignity intact despite being treated shamefully. That's enough for now. The rest we can learn as we go. Clara looked around Pine Ridge one more time, at the shuttered windows in judgmental silence, at the church where her dreams had died, at the mountains that rose like fortress walls around the small town. When she turned back to Jake Steele, her voice was steady with decision. Yes, she said simply. I accept. The wedding ceremony that followed Jake's proposal lasted exactly 7 minutes. Reverend Matthews, roused from his evening meal by Jake's polite but insistent knocking, performed the abbreviated service with the bewildered efficiency of a man who'd learned not to question the unusual circumstances that frontier life regularly provided. Clara found herself repeating vows to a man whose full name she'd learned only moments before speaking it aloud. Jacob Steele. The name suited him somehow. Strong, straightforward, with an edge that suggested there might be more beneath the surface than his mountain man appearance revealed. As the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jake offered Clara his arm with careful courtesy. The simple gold band he'd slipped onto her finger during the ceremony was clearly expensive, the metal warm and heavy against her skin. Another small mystery to add to the growing collection surrounding her unexpected husband. The ride into the mountains began just as the last light faded from the western sky. Jake had secured Clara's few belongings, a small trunk containing her teaching materials, and the modest wardrobe she'd brought west. To his pack mule, with the same methodical efficiency he seemed to bring to everything. It's about a 3-hour ride to my place, Jake said as he helped Clara mount the gentle mare he'd somehow procured during their brief time in town. Trail gets steep in places, but Luna here knows a way, even in the dark. Clara settled into the unfamiliar saddle, grateful for the riding lessons her father had insisted upon during her privileged Philadelphia childhood. Those skills, unused for years, returned slowly as they began their ascent into the Colorado wilderness. The path Jake followed seemed more like an animal trail than a proper road, winding through stands of towering pines and across rocky streams that caught the moonlight like scattered silver. The air grew thinner and colder as they climbed, carrying scents Clara had never experienced. Pine resin, granite dust, and something wild and clean that made her lungs ache with each breath. You warm enough? Jake asked during one of their brief rest stops, his voice carrying concern that seemed genuine, rather than merely polite. Clara pulled her traveling cloak tighter around her shoulders. I'm fine, thank you. But she wasn't fine, not really. The enormity of what she'd just done was beginning to sink in as they rode deeper into the wilderness. She'd married a complete stranger and was now following him into country that looked like something from an adventure novel. Beautiful but utterly alien to everything she'd known. Jake seemed to sense her growing unease. My cabin's well built, he said quietly. Good stone foundation, tight roof, proper fireplace. You'll be comfortable there. And safe? The question escaped before Clara could stop herself. Jake's response was immediate and firm. Safe as anywhere on earth, I promise you that. Something in his voice made Clara believe him, and she found her anxiety easing slightly as they continued their ascent. The cabin appeared suddenly as they crested a ridge, nestled in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines. Moonlight revealed a structure much larger and more substantial than Clara had expected. This wasn't the rough lean-to of a poor mountain trapper, but a genuine home built by someone who understood both craftsmanship and comfort. Jake, Clara said softly, unable to hide her surprise. This is beautiful. He dismounted and helped her down, his hands steady and respectful. Took me the better part of 2 years to build it right. Figure if a man's going to live somewhere, he might as well live well. The interior of the cabin surpassed even Clara's elevated expectations. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace that Jake quickly coaxed to life, revealing furniture that showed both quality and care. A handmade table and chairs occupied the center of the space, while built-in shelves along the walls held an impressive collection of books. Clara moved closer to examine the volumes, her teacher's instincts immediately engaged. Dickens, Shakespeare, Emerson, she murmured, running her fingers along the leather spines. This is quite a library for a mountain man. Jake's expression grew carefully neutral. I like to read when the evenings get long. But Clara's educated eye noted more than just the books. The quality of the furniture, the precision of the construction, the small luxuries scattered throughout the cabin, all spoke of resources far beyond what a simple trapper or hunter could afford. There's a separate room through that door, Jake said, gesturing toward the back of the cabin. I'll take the main room here by the fire. Want to make sure you have privacy until we figure out how this arrangement is going to work. Clara felt a rush of gratitude for his consideration. The marriage might have been hasty and unconventional, but Jake seemed determined to treat her with respect rather than taking advantage of her vulnerable position. The bedroom proved as well appointed as the main room. A proper bed with a feather mattress, a washstand with pitcher and basin, even a small mirror and dresser. Clara set her traveling bag on the bed and tried to process the contradictions her new home presented. Jake, she called through the partially open door. May I ask what you do for a living? This cabin, these furnishings, they represent considerable expense. There was a pause before he answered, and when he did, his voice carried a careful neutrality that Clara was beginning to recognize. I trap hunt, do some guiding for folks wanting to see the high country. Mountain life can be profitable if you know what you're doing. It was a reasonable explanation, but something about Jake's tone suggested there was more to the story. Clara filed the observation away for future consideration. Over the next few days, Clara began to understand both the comforts and challenges of mountain living. Jake proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to maintain the fire, where to draw water from the nearby spring, and how to preserve food for the winter months ahead. Most important thing about living up here, Jake explained as he demonstrated the proper way to bank a fire for overnight burning, is understanding that everything depends on everything else. Fire keeps you warm, but it also keeps the animals away. Water has to be protected from freezing, but it also has to stay clean. Every task connects to your survival. Clara found herself fascinated by the intricate knowledge required for mountain living. Her Philadelphia education had prepared her to discuss literature and music, but Jake was teaching her skills that meant the difference between life and death in the wilderness. You're a quick learner, Jake observed on her fourth day as he watched her successfully prepare a meal using only the cabin's basic equipment. Most folks from back east take weeks to adapt to cooking over an open fire. I had good teachers in domestic skills, Claire replied, pleased by his approval. My mother insisted that every lady should know how to manage a household, regardless of her station in life. It was the first time she'd mentioned her family, and Jake seemed to notice. You miss them? Your folks back in Philadelphia? Clara's hands stilled as she stirred the pot of venison stew Jake had provided. My parents died 3 years ago. Cholera. My sister married well and moved to Boston. But she made it clear that my presence would be an embarrassment to her new social position. Jake's expression darkened. Seems like there's a lot of people willing to abandon family when it becomes inconvenient. The bitterness in his voice suggested personal experience with betrayal, and Clara wondered what wounds lay hidden beneath his mountain man exterior. As the days passed, Clara became aware of subtle signs that Jake's story about being a simple trapper didn't quite add up. The quality of his tools and weapons was exceptional. His horses were blooded stock rather than the common animals most frontiersmen could afford, and there were moments when his carefully casual speech slipped, revealing the educated vocabulary of someone with formal schooling. One morning, while Jake was checking his trap lines, Clara discovered a small room behind a cleverly concealed door in the cabin's main room. Inside, she found evidence that confirmed her growing suspicions about her husband's mysterious background. The room contained a desk of polished mahogany, a leather chair that belonged in a Denver mansion rather than a mountain cabin, and most tellingly, a small safe built into the stone wall. Clara didn't attempt to open it, but its very presence suggested resources far beyond those of a mountain trapper. More intriguingly, she found a collection of newspapers from Denver and other Colorado towns, all dated within the past year. The headlines spoke of railroad development, mining investments, and the kind of financial news that would interest someone with significant business holdings. Clara carefully returned everything to its original position and retreated to the main room before Jake returned. But her mind churned with questions about the man she'd married and the life he'd built in these remote mountains. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing their simple meal, Clara studied Jake's profile in the flickering light. He was handsome in a rugged way that spoke of outdoor living and physical work, but there were moments when his expression held depths that suggested experiences beyond hunting and trapping. "Jake," she said carefully, "have you always lived in the mountains?" His gray eyes met hers across the small table. "Not always. I came here about 3 years ago, looking for solitude and a chance to start over." "Start over from what?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, poking at the fire with a wooden stick. "From mistakes," he said finally. "From a life that wasn't working out the way I'd planned." Clara nodded, understanding the desire for a fresh beginning better than most. "I can appreciate that sentiment. Can you?" Jake's voice held genuine curiosity. "What brought an educated woman like you to answer a frontier marriage advertisement?" Clara considered how much of her story to share. "Necessity mostly. After my parents died, I supported myself by teaching. But when the school board learned about certain difficulties in my past, they felt I was no longer suitable for educating young minds." "What kind of difficulties?" "The kind that result from trusting the wrong man with your reputation," Clara said simply. "I was briefly engaged to a gentleman who turned out to be already married. When his wife discovered our relationship, the scandal made it impossible for me to continue teaching in Philadelphia." Jake's jaw tightened. "Seems like you've had your share of men who aren't what they claim to be." "Present company excluded, I hope," Clara said with a slight smile. Jake met her gaze steadily. "I've never lied to you, Clara, but I haven't told you everything either. We both came to these mountains carrying baggage from our pasts." The honesty in his voice made Clara's heart skip slightly. Over the past week, she'd found herself increasingly drawn to this quiet, capable man who'd rescued her from public humiliation and asked nothing in return except her willingness to try building something together. "Perhaps," she said softly, "we don't need to know everything about each other's past to build a future together." Jake's smile was warm and genuine. "Perhaps not, though I suspect we'll learn more about each other than we bargained for before winter sets in." Outside their warm cabin, the Colorado mountains stretched away into darkness, holding secrets of their own. Clara pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders and wondered what other discoveries awaited her in this beautiful, dangerous country she was learning to call home. The morning Clara shot her first deer was the morning she truly understood what it meant to survive in the Colorado mountains. The animal had appeared at the edge of their clearing just after dawn, a young buck picking his way delicately through the frost-covered grass while Clara practiced with Jake's rifle. "Don't think," Jake whispered from his position behind her, his breath warm against her ear. "Just breathe steady and squeeze gentle when it feels right." Clara's hands had stopped trembling weeks ago when handling firearms, but this was different. This wasn't target practice against a piece of bark or an empty can. This was life and death, meat for winter, the difference between comfort and starvation in the months ahead. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the sound echoing off the mountain walls like thunder. The buck dropped cleanly, and Clara felt a complex mixture of triumph and sorrow that Jake seemed to understand without explanation. "Good shot," he said quietly, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "Clean and quick." The animal didn't suffer. Clara lowered the rifle, studying Jake's weathered profile. "Does it ever get easier? Taking a life, even for survival?" "No," Jake replied honestly. "The day it becomes easy is the day you've lost something important about yourself. But necessary doesn't have to be easy." Over the following hours, Jake guided Clara through the process of field dressing and butchering the deer, his movements efficient and respectful. Clara forced herself to learn each step, understanding that squeamishness was a luxury she couldn't afford if she intended to survive mountain winters. Most folks back east never see where their meat comes from, Jake observed as he showed Clara how to properly preserve the venison using salt and mountain herbs. They buy it clean and wrapped from a butcher, never thinking about the animal that died to feed them. Clara's hands were red with blood and cold from the morning air, but she continued working. My father believed in understanding all aspects of life, including the unpleasant ones. He said ignorance was the privilege of the wealthy. Wise man, Jake said, then paused in his work. What did he do for a living? Clara hesitated, then decided honesty was becoming a habit between them. He owned a textile mill. We were quite comfortable until the business failed during the Panic of '66. Jake's knife stilled against the meat he was cutting. A mill owner's daughter. Clara, you were raised with servants and fine things. Are you sure you can adapt to this? He gestured around their simple mountain clearing. Jake Steele, Clara said firmly, wiping her bloody hands on the rough apron he'd provided. I may have been raised with privilege, but I wasn't raised to be helpless. Besides, comfort isn't just about luxury. It's about security, honest work, and knowing the person you share your life with won't abandon you when circumstances become difficult. Something in Jake's expression softened at her words. I won't abandon you, Clara. Whatever happens, whatever you might learn about me in the future, I want you to remember that. The serious tone in his voice gave Clara pause. What might I learn about you? But Jake had already turned back to his work, the moment of openness closed off by his familiar reserve. That afternoon brought Clara's first encounter with the more dangerous aspects of mountain life. They were gathering late berries in a meadow about a mile from the cabin when Jake suddenly went rigid, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle he always carried. Clara, he said quietly, don't move fast, but start backing toward that cluster of rocks behind you. Clara's heart began pounding as she caught sight of what had alarmed Jake. A massive grizzly bear had emerged from the tree line, drawn by the same berry patch they'd been harvesting. The animal was enormous, easily 8 feet tall when it rose on its hind legs to test the air. It's looking for food, not trouble, Jake murmured, raising his rifle but not yet aiming. Bears usually want nothing to do with humans, but this one looks thin for the season, might be desperate enough to be dangerous. Clara forced herself to move slowly toward the rocks, every instinct screaming at her to run. The bear's small eyes fixed on them, and she could see the intelligence there, the calculation of a predator deciding whether they represented threat or opportunity. The confrontation stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The bear dropped to all fours, sniffed the air once more, then made its decision. Instead of retreating, it began moving toward them, with the deceptively lazy gait that Clara now recognized as the approach of a hunting animal. Jake's rifle spoke once, the bullet striking the ground inches from the bear's front paws. The animal reared back, startled but not frightened enough to retreat. Jake, Clara whispered, her voice tight with fear. I know, he replied grimly, working the rifle's action to chamber another round. If it charges, get behind the rocks and stay there no matter what you hear. The bear took another step forward, and Jake fired again, this time aiming to wound rather than warn. The bullet caught the animal in the shoulder, spinning it around with a roar of pain and rage that echoed across the meadow. Instead of retreating, the wounded bear charged. Jake's third shot was precise and final, dropping the massive animal 20 feet from where Clara crouched behind the rocks. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Clara, Jake's voice was steady despite what they'd just experienced. You can come out now. It's over. Clara emerged from her shelter on trembling legs, staring at the massive carcass that had come so close to ending their lives. Have you done that before? Faced down a charging bear? Jake was already moving to examine the dead animal, his movements careful despite the apparent safety. A few times, bears are usually reasonable creatures, but a hungry bear in a hard season will take risks they normally wouldn't. You saved my life, Clara said quietly. Jake looked up from his examination of the bear, his gray eyes serious. We saved each other. You kept calm, followed instructions, didn't panic and make things worse. That's what partners do. Partners. The word carried weight between them, more significant than their hasty marriage vows or their careful domestic arrangements. Clara felt something shift in her understanding of their relationship. "What do we do with it now?" she asked, gesturing toward the bear. "Nothing goes to waste up here," Jake replied, pulling out his skinning knife. "The meat will keep us fed for weeks, the fur will keep us warm, and the fat will provide light and waterproofing. In the mountains, everything has value." They worked together through the afternoon, Clara following Jake's careful instructions as they processed the bear. The work was hard and bloody, but Clara found herself taking pride in her growing competence with tasks she'd never imagined herself performing. As evening approached and they prepared to head back to the cabin, Clara made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about her husband. While Jake was securing the last of the bear meat for transport, Clara had wandered toward a small outcropping of rocks, where she'd noticed unusual scratches in the stone. What she found there made her breath catch in her throat. Hidden behind a carefully placed boulder was a metal box, partially concealed but not buried. The scratches on the rock weren't natural erosion. They were deliberate marks, the kind someone might make to help remember a hiding place. Clara glanced back toward Jake, who was still occupied with loading their pack animals. Curiosity overcoming caution, she worked the box free from its hiding place and opened it. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were more gold coins than Clara had ever seen in one place. But it wasn't just the quantity that shocked her. It was the dates stamped on the coins and the distinctive markings that identified them as Union Pacific Railroad payroll. Clara's hands shook as she recognized what she was looking at. These weren't the honest earnings of a mountain trapper and guide. This was stolen money, and recently stolen at that. The newest coins were dated 1869, the same year she'd married Jake Steele. "Clara?" Jake's voice carried concern as he noticed her absence. "Where did you go?" Clara quickly replaced the box and stepped out from behind the rocks, her mind reeling with implications. The man she'd married wasn't just hiding a comfortable past. He was hiding a criminal present. "I'm here," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just checking to make sure we didn't leave anything behind." As they rode back toward the cabin in the gathering darkness, Clara struggled with what she'd discovered. The gold in that hidden cache represented more money than most people saw in a lifetime. It also represented the kind of crime that brought federal marshals and bounty hunters into the mountains. "You're quiet tonight," Jake observed as they approached their clearing. "The bear encounter shake you up more than you thought?" Clara looked at this man who'd rescued her from humiliation, who'd patiently taught her to survive in the wilderness, who'd treated her with respect and growing affection. The same man who apparently robbed trains for a living. "I'm fine," she lied, "just tired from all the excitement." But as they unloaded their supplies and settled into their evening routine, Clara couldn't shake the questions that crowded her mind. Who was Jake Steele, really? How long had he been hiding stolen gold in the mountains? And most importantly, what did this discovery mean for their marriage and her own safety? Outside their warm cabin, the Colorado wilderness stretched away into darkness, holding secrets that might prove more dangerous than any grizzly bear. Clara pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders and wondered if the man sleeping by the fire was her salvation or her doom. The mountains, she was learning, held many kinds of predators. Some walked on 4 legs and announced their presence with roars and claws. Others walked on 2 legs and hid behind gentle words and patient teaching. Clara stared at the ceiling of her small bedroom, listening to Jake's quiet breathing from the main room, and wondered which kind of predator she'd married. Tomorrow, she decided, she would have to choose between confronting him with what she'd found or pretending ignorance while she figured out how to protect herself. Either choice carried risks she wasn't sure she was prepared to face. But one thing was certain. Her education in mountain survival had just taken a far more dangerous turn than learning to shoot deer or face down bears. Clara waited 3 days before confronting Jake about the hidden gold. 3 days of careful observation and growing certainty that the man she'd married was living a lie that could destroy them both. During those days, she watched him move through their mountain routine with the same patient competence he'd always shown, teaching her to read weather signs and preserve food for winter, never suspecting that she'd discovered his secret. The confrontation came on a gray October morning when the first snow dusted the highest peaks around their valley. Jake was splitting firewood outside the cabin while Clara prepared their breakfast, both of them moving through domestic tasks that had become comfortingly familiar over their weeks together. "Jake," Clara said as she set his coffee beside him at their small table, "we need to talk." Something in her tone made him look up sharply, his gray eyes immediately alert. "What about?" Clara sat across from him, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "About the Union Pacific Railroad, payroll gold hidden behind the rocks near Bear Meadow." The silence that followed was profound. Jake's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips, and Clara watched all expression drain from his weathered face. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "How long have you known?" "3 days, since we processed the bear." Clara's voice was steady despite the hammering of her heart. "The question is, how long have you been robbing trains?" Jake set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision and leaned back in his chair. 3 years, since the summer of 1866. The blunt admission hit Clara like a physical blow, even though she'd been expecting it. The Union Pacific? Mostly, some Denver and Rio Grande lines when opportunities presented themselves. Jake's voice carried no shame, no justification, just the flat recital of facts. "I've hit 17 trains in total, taken approximately $50,000 in gold and currency." Clara struggled to reconcile this confession with the gentleman who'd patiently taught her to survive in the wilderness. "And you've been hiding the money up here in the mountains?" "Some of it. Some I spent on supplies and equipment. Some went to bribes and information." Jake studied Clara's face carefully. "Are you planning to turn me in to the authorities?" The question hung between them like smoke from their fire. Clara realized that her answer would determine not just their future together, but quite possibly whether Jake lived or died. Federal marshals didn't typically show mercy to train robbers. "That depends," Clara said quietly, "on whether you're planning to continue robbing trains." Jake was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire crackling in their stone hearth. "I hadn't decided. The money I've already taken could support us comfortably for years, but robbing trains was never about the money, Clara. It was about something else entirely." Clara leaned forward, sensing that Jake was finally ready to share the truth that had driven him to this remote mountain sanctuary. "What else?" Jake rose from his chair and moved to the window, staring out at the snow-dusted peaks that surrounded their valley. When he spoke, his voice carried pain that had been carefully buried but never healed. "My real name is Jacob Sterling. My father is Jonathan Sterling, owner of Sterling Mining and Development, one of the largest mining operations in Colorado Territory. I was raised in Denver, educated at Harvard, groomed to take over the family business." Clara felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The expensive belongings, the educated vocabulary, the quality of Jake's cabin and possessions, all spoke of someone with access to significant wealth. "What changed?" she asked softly. Jake's reflection in the window looked haunted. "I discovered that my father's fortune was built on the bodies of Chinese workers who died building the railroad. Slave wages, dangerous conditions, deliberate indifference to worker safety. When I confronted him about it, he told me that progress required sacrifice, and that some people were simply more expendable than others." Clara began to understand the anger that had driven Jake to his criminal life. "So you decided to strike back at the railroad." "I told myself I was evening the scales, taking from a system that had taken so much from people who couldn't defend themselves." Jake turned from the window to face Clara directly. "But if I'm being honest, it was mostly about punishing my father and everything he represented." "And the money you stole?" "Initially, I sent most of it anonymously to the families of workers who'd been killed or injured. But after a while, I started keeping more for myself. Told myself I deserved compensation for the risks I was taking." Jake's voice carried bitter self-awareness. "By the end, I was just another thief with a sob story to justify my crimes." Clara absorbed this revelation in silence, understanding now why Jake had seemed so comfortable with expensive things while living the life of a mountain hermit. "Your family doesn't know where you are?" "They think I'm dead. I made sure of that after my last robbery went wrong, and a railroad detective almost caught me. Jacob Sterling died in a fire at a Denver hotel, and Jake Steele was born in these mountains." The weight of Jake's confession settled between them like a physical presence. Clara realized she was married to a man who'd not only committed serious crimes but had faked his own death to escape the consequences. Clara, Jake said quietly, I need you to understand something. Whatever you decide about us, about our marriage, I won't blame you. You didn't sign up to be married to a wanted criminal. Clara studied her husband's face, seeing both the gentle man who'd rescued her and the bitter young man who'd chosen crime over confronting his father's cruelty. Are you still that angry person who started robbing trains? Jake considered the question seriously. Number living up here, building this life, meeting you, it's changed something fundamental in me. The anger that drove me to crime has mostly burned itself out. Mostly. There's still a part of me that wants to hurt the people who profit from other people's suffering, but it's a smaller part than it used to be. Clara rose from her chair and moved to stand beside Jake at the window. Outside, snow was beginning to fall more heavily, the first real storm of the approaching winter. Jake, I need to tell you something about my own past, something I haven't been entirely honest about. Jake turned to look at her, surprise flickering in his gray eyes. What kind of something? Clara took a deep breath, realizing that if they were going to build a real marriage, it had to be founded on complete honesty. I told you my father's textile business failed during the Panic of '66. That's true, but I didn't tell you how it failed or what my father did about it. Clara, let me finish. Clara's voice was firm. My father didn't just lose his business to bad investments. He was systematically cheated by his business partner, a man named Harrison Blackwood, who falsified records and embezzled funds over several years. Jake's expression sharpened. Blackwood. Wasn't that the name of the man who was supposed to marry you? Roland Blackwood, Harrison's son. Clara's voice carried bitter satisfaction. When I realized who Roland was, I knew the marriage advertisement was part of a scheme to cheat me out of whatever money I might have left. You knew he was going to rob you? Clara nodded. I suspected, but I came west anyway, hoping I was wrong. When I turned out to be right, I wasn't really surprised. Jake stared at her in amazement. Clara, why didn't you tell me this before? Because I was afraid you'd think I was using you to get revenge on the Blackwoods. And because... Clara paused, gathering courage for her final admission. Because I wanted to tell Roland's father that his son had been caught cheating the daughter of a man he'd already destroyed. You're not the helpless victim I thought I was rescuing, Jake said slowly. No more than you're the simple mountain trapper I thought I was marrying. They stood together in comfortable silence, both processing the implications of their mutual deceptions. Outside, the snowfall was growing heavier, promising that they would be snowed in together for the long Colorado winter. Clara, Jake said finally, if you want me to take you back to civilization before the passes close for winter, I'll do it. You deserve better than being married to a man with my kind of past. Clara turned to face him fully, studying the weathered features she'd grown to love over their weeks together. Jacob Sterling, or Jake Steele, you're still the man who stepped forward when I needed help. You're still the man who's treated me with respect and kindness, who's taught me to be stronger than I knew I could be. Even knowing what I've done, even knowing what you've done. Clara reached out to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. We're both running from our past, Jake. The question is whether we want to keep running or start building something new together. Jake's hand covered hers, warm and steady. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you're done robbing trains, if you're ready to be Jake Steele instead of Jacob Sterling, then I'm ready to be your wife in truth as well as name. Jake's smile was slow and genuine, transforming his face in ways that made Clara's breath catch. Are you sure? Because once the snow starts falling in earnest, we'll be trapped up here together until spring. No going back, no second thoughts. Clara moved closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. I'm sure. When Jake kissed her, it was with the careful reverence of a man who'd been given something precious he hadn't expected to deserve. Clara kissed him back with the passion of a woman who'd finally found someone worth trusting with her heart and her future. Outside their warm cabin, snow continued to fall, sealing them into their mountain sanctuary for the long winter ahead. But inside, by the flickering light of their fire, Two people who'd found each other by accident discovered that sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected places. Jake, Clara whispered against his lips. What? No more secrets. No more secrets, he agreed, and sealed the promise with another kiss that spoke of new beginnings and the courage to leave the past where it belonged. The warning came from an unexpected source. Old Pete Garrison, a grizzled prospector who worked the high country and occasionally traded supplies with Jake. Pete arrived at their cabin on a bitter November morning, his mule laden with winter provisions and his weathered face creased with worry. Jake, Pete said without preamble as he dismounted stiffly from his saddle, got trouble heading your way. Federal man been asking questions in Pine Ridge, showing around sketches and offering reward money? Clara felt ice form in her stomach as Jake's expression went hard and alert. This was the moment they'd both known might come, the past refusing to stay buried in the mountain wilderness. What kind of federal man? Jake asked, helping Pete secure his mule, while Clara prepared coffee for their unexpected visitor. Detective from the Union Pacific Railroad. Big fellow, well-dressed, talks like he's got education and money behind him. Pete accepted the steaming cup gratefully. Name of Morrison, Samuel Morrison. Been tracking you for near 3 years, from what I could gather. Jake's face went pale beneath his mountain tan. Morrison. I thought he was dead. You know him? Clara asked, though she dreaded the answer. Jake sank into his chair beside their fire, suddenly looking older than his 35 years. Sam Morrison was the detective who nearly caught me during my last train robbery. There was a fight, and his partner, a young man named David Morrison, was killed when his gun went off during our struggle. His partner? Pete's eyes narrowed with understanding. This Morrison fellow mentioned his brother. Said you murdered him in cold blood during a robbery near Pueblo. It wasn't murder, Jake said quietly, but Clara could hear the guilt that had been eating at him for 3 years. David Morrison drew on me first. His gun discharged when we struggled for it. I tried to help him, but you left him to die, Clara finished, understanding now why Jake had chosen exile in the mountains. I stayed long enough to know he was beyond help. Then I ran. Left him there for his brother to find. Jake's voice was heavy with old grief. Sam Morrison has every right to want me dead. Pete leaned forward, his expression grave. Well, he's getting close to finding you. Asked specific questions about mountain men living alone, about cabins in the high country, about anyone matching your description, offered $1,000 for information leading to your capture. Clara's breath caught. $1,000 was more money than most frontier families saw in years. That kind of reward would tempt even honest men to become bounty hunters. How much time do we have? Jake asked, already moving toward the cabinet where he kept his weapons. Hard to say. Morrison's been methodical, working his way through every settlement between here and Denver. But the early snow's been slowing him down, and most folks don't know enough about the back country to guide him directly to your place. Jake was loading his rifle with the smooth efficiency of someone preparing for war. Most folks, but not all. What do you mean? Clara asked, though she was beginning to understand the implications. Roland Blackwood knew I lived in the mountains. If Morrison tracks him down and offers enough money, Roland might remember enough details to put Morrison on our trail. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold. Jake, we should leave. Pack what we can and head deeper into the mountains. Can't, Pete said grimly. Storm's coming in tonight. Big one by the look of the sky. Moving now would be suicide. Besides, Morrison's no fool. He'll have men watching the likely escape routes. Jake moved to the window, studying the leaden sky that promised heavy snow. Then we make our stand here. Clara, I want you to pack a survival kit. Food, warm clothes, ammunition. If things go wrong, I'll try to draw Morrison away from the cabin while you escape. Absolutely not, Clara said firmly. We're partners, remember? I'm not running away and leaving you to face this alone. Jake turned from the window, his gray eyes fierce with protective concern. Clara, you don't understand. Morrison isn't just after me for the robbery. He blames me for destroying his family. David was his younger brother, fresh out of college, working as a railroad detective to impress their father. When David died, it broke their parents. Morrison's mother died of grief 6 months later, and their father lost his mind. Morrison's been living for revenge ever since. All the more reason why I'm not leaving you to face him alone, Clara replied. 3 years of hunting have probably made him unhinged. You'll need backup. Pete nodded approvingly. She's got sand, Jake, and she's right about Morrison being unhinged. Man I saw in Pine Ridge looked like he hadn't slept properly in months. Eyes like a wolf that's been tracking wounded prey. Jake studied Clara's determined face, seeing the school teacher who'd adapted to mountain life, who'd faced down grizzly bears and learned to shoot with deadly accuracy. If you stay, you'll be in as much danger as I am. Morrison might decide you're an accomplice. Then we'll face that danger together, Clara said simply. Besides, I know these mountains now almost as well as you do. That gives us advantages Morrison won't expect. The sound of distant rifle shots echoing across the valley ended their debate. Jake counted the shots, 3 spaced evenly, then 2 close together. A signal, and not one he recognized. He's here, Jake said grimly. Morrison's announcing his presence, letting me know he's found me. Pete grabbed his rifle and moved to the cabin's side window. How many men you figure he brought? Morrison works alone when it's personal, Jake replied, checking his weapons one final time. But he might have hired local help for tracking. Clara took her position at the rear window, her rifle loaded and ready. The shooting lessons Jake had given her were about to face their ultimate test. What's his plan likely to be? Patient siege. Morrison's smart and methodical. He'll try to cut off our escape routes and wait for us to make a mistake or run out of supplies. Jake moved to the front window, studying the tree line for movement. The snow works in our favor. It'll slow him down and limit his visibility. The next shot came from much closer, perhaps 200 yards from their cabin. This time it was followed by Morrison's voice, carrying clearly across the snow-covered clearing. Jacob Sterling! The voice was cultured, educated, but edged with 3 years of obsessive hatred. I know you're in there. I've been tracking you since the snow started falling. There's nowhere left to run. Jake stepped back from the window but didn't reply. Engaging in conversation would only give Morrison information about their defensive positions. I want to talk before this gets unpleasant, Morrison continued. I'm offering you a chance to surrender peacefully. Walk out with your hands visible, and I'll see that you make it to trial alive. Don't believe him, Pete whispered. Man like that didn't track you for 3 years just to hand you over to a judge. Jake nodded grimly. Morrison's offer of safe surrender was almost certainly a lie. The federal detective wanted personal revenge, not legal justice. I know you have a woman in there with you, Morrison called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. The school teacher you married in Pine Ridge. She doesn't need to die for your crimes, Sterling. Send her out, and I'll let her walk away unharmed. Clara felt anger flare at Morrison's assumption that she was a helpless victim in need of rescue. He really doesn't know me very well, does he? Clara, he's giving you a chance, Jake said urgently. Maybe you should take it. Not a chance in hell, Clara replied firmly. We're in this together, Jake. Stop trying to protect me and start thinking about how we protect each other. Another shot rang out, this one striking the cabin's front wall with a solid thunk. Morrison was testing their defenses, probing for weak points. You've got 10 minutes to decide, Sterling, Morrison shouted. Then I start making this cabin very uncomfortable for anyone inside. Jake looked around their home, the stone fireplace he'd built with his own hands, the furniture they'd arranged together, the life they'd created from nothing but hope and hard work. In a few minutes, all of it might be destroyed. Pete, Jake said quietly, there's a root cellar beneath the cabin with a tunnel that leads to the creek bed. If things go bad, that's your way out. What about you two? Jake and Clara exchanged a look that spoke of shared determination and absolute trust. We're making our stand here, Jake said simply. Together, Clara added, checking her rifle's action one final time. Outside, the first large snowflakes of the coming storm began to fall, and somewhere in the gathering dusk, Samuel Morrison prepared to end his 3-year hunt for the man who'd destroyed his family. The mountains that had provided sanctuary for Jake and Clara were about to become a battlefield, and only the strongest would survive the storm that was coming from both nature and human obsession. Jake, Clara said softly as they prepared for Morrison's assault. Yeah, No matter what happens, I don't regret staying. Jake's smile was fierce and proud. Neither do I. The final confrontation between past and future was about to begin. Morrison's 10-minute ultimatum expired with the arrival of the blizzard. The storm struck their mountain valley like the fist of an angry god, bringing winds that howled through the pine trees and snow that fell so heavily it turned the world into a white, impenetrable wall. Clara pressed herself against the cabin's front window, trying to maintain visual contact with their surroundings as the storm intensified. I can't see anything beyond 50 feet, she reported to Jake. The snow's too thick. That works both ways, Jake replied grimly from his position at the side window. Morrison can't see us either, but he also can't coordinate any kind of organized assault. The first shot came without warning, a rifle bullet that punched through the cabin's front wall and buried itself in the stone fireplace behind them. Clara ducked instinctively, her heart hammering as she realized how close the shot had come. He's shooting blind, Pete observed from the rear window, trying to flush us out or make us panic. Jake moved carefully to the front door, keeping low to avoid presenting a target. Morrison, he called out. You're going to get yourself killed out there. This storm's only getting worse. Morrison's answer was another shot, this one aimed at the sound of Jake's voice. The bullet struck the door frame, sending splinters of wood flying. He's not listening to reason, Clara said, working to keep her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. 3 years of obsession doesn't leave much room for reason, Jake replied. Morrison's past the point where anything matters except killing me. The siege continued for nearly an hour, with Morrison firing occasionally from different positions around their cabin. Each shot seemed to come from a different direction, forcing them to constantly adjust their defensive positions. The man was systematically probing their defenses while the storm provided cover for his movements. He's good at this, Pete admitted grudgingly. Keeps us guessing where he'll show up next. Military training, Jake said. Morrison served in the war before joining the railroad, knows how to conduct a proper siege. Clara was beginning to understand the true danger of their situation. Morrison wasn't just some revenge-crazed amateur. He was a trained professional with years of experience in tracking and combat, and he'd spent 3 years planning this confrontation. The attack, when it finally came, was swift and coordinated. Morrison used the storm's howling wind to mask his approach, appearing suddenly at the cabin's rear window, where Pete was standing guard. The glass exploded inward as Morrison's rifle butt smashed through, followed immediately by the man himself. Pete tried to bring his own weapon to bear, but Morrison was already inside, moving with the deadly efficiency of someone who'd planned every detail of his assault. A single blow from Morrison's rifle stock dropped the old prospector unconscious to the cabin floor. Nobody move! Morrison commanded, his rifle now trained on Clara, while his pale eyes searched for Jake. Sterling, show yourself or the woman dies. Clara found herself staring down the barrel of Morrison's rifle, seeing death in the federal detective's hollow, obsessed gaze. The man looked exactly as Pete had described him, gaunt from months of relentless pursuit, eyes like a wolf that had been tracking wounded prey too long. Jake stepped into view, his own rifle held carefully away from his body. I'm here, Morrison. Let Clara go. Your quarrel is with me. Morrison's laugh was bitter and humorless. My quarrel is with everyone who helped you escape justice for 3 years. This woman married you knowing what you were. That makes her an accomplice. She didn't know, Jake lied smoothly. I never told her about my past. She's innocent in all this. Innocent? Morrison's voice cracked with hysteria. My brother was innocent. David was 23 years old, trying to make his mark in the world, trying to make our father proud. You murdered him for money, Sterling, and then you disappeared like a coward while my family fell apart. Clara could see the madness burning in Morrison's eyes. 3 years of grief and rage that had consumed everything human in the man. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was about feeding a hunger for revenge that could never be satisfied. Morrison, Jake said carefully, I've regretted David's death every day for 3 years. If I could bring him back, I would. But killing Clara won't make your pain any less. Won't it? Morrison swung his rifle toward Jake, but kept it positioned so he could easily target Clara if Jake made any sudden moves. I've imagined this moment for 3 years, Sterling. I've planned exactly how I'm going to make you suffer before you die. That's when Clara noticed something Morrison hadn't. The wind had shifted, and snow was now blowing directly through the broken rear window. The temperature in the cabin was dropping rapidly, and Morrison, focused entirely on his revenge, seemed unaware of the deadly danger the blizzard represented. Morrison, Clara said quietly, you need to let us board up that window. The storm will kill us all if we don't maintain the cabin's warmth. Morrison's laugh was genuinely unhinged. I don't care if we all freeze to death, as long as Sterling dies first. Jake caught Clara's eyes and saw that she'd recognized what he had. Morrison's obsession had made him careless about survival. The federal detective was so focused on revenge that he was willing to die for it, but that same single-mindedness would be his weakness. The gold, Jake said suddenly. Morrison, I still have most of the money I stole. $50,000 hidden in these mountains. Let Clara live, and I'll tell you where it is. Morrison's eyes flicked between Jake and Clara, calculating. You think I care about money? This was never about recovering stolen property. No, but your superiors care about it, Jake replied. Return $50,000 in stolen railroad gold, and you'll be a hero. Kill me without recovering the money, and you're just another lawman who let personal feelings compromise his mission. Clara could see that Jake's words were having an effect. Morrison was torn between his desire for immediate revenge and the professional pride that had driven him to become a federal detective in the first place. Where is it? Morrison demanded. Hidden in a cave system about 2 miles north of here, Jake said. But you'll never find it in this storm. Try to travel in this blizzard, and you'll be dead within an hour. Morrison glanced toward the broken window, finally seeming to notice the snow that was rapidly accumulating inside the cabin. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since his dramatic entrance, and their breath was now visible in the frigid air. Then we wait, Morrison said grimly. When the storm passes, you'll take me to the gold. After I recover it, then I'll kill you. And Clara? Morrison's smile was cold and predatory. She's insurance that you'll cooperate. For the next several hours, they maintained an uneasy standoff. Morrison kept his rifle trained on Clara, while Jake was forced to maintain the fire and attempt repairs to the broken window. The storm continued to rage outside, making any thoughts of escape impossible. But Clara was learning things about their captor that Jake couldn't observe from his position. Morrison was exhausted from 3 years of pursuit, running on obsession and little else. His hands shook slightly from fatigue, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd been surviving on hatred for too long. More importantly, Morrison was a city man trying to survive in mountain wilderness. He didn't understand the signs that told Clara the blizzard was growing worse, that the cabin's heating system was inadequate with the broken window, or that they were all in danger of freezing to death if the situation didn't change soon. Morrison, Clara said during a brief lull in the wind's howling, you're from Denver, aren't you? City born and raised? Morrison's eyes narrowed suspiciously. What does that matter? It matters because you don't understand what this storm means, Clara replied calmly. You're so focused on revenge that you're not paying attention to the fact that we're all going to die if we don't work together to survive the next few hours. She's right, Jake added, noticing that frost was beginning to form on the inside walls of the cabin. This is a killing storm, Morrison, the kind that leaves bodies frozen solid until spring thaw. Morrison's response was to fire a shot through the cabin roof, letting in even more cold air. Then you'd better pray it passes quickly, because I'm not leaving these mountains without your corpse. It was then that Clara made her move. Using skills Jake had taught her about reading people and situations, she'd been waiting for the moment when Morrison's attention would be divided. When the federal detective turned to check the security of the front door, Clara acted. She didn't try to grab Morrison's rifle or attack him directly. Instead, she kicked over the oil lamp that provided their only light, plunging the cabin into darkness just as a particularly violent gust of wind sent snow swirling through both the broken window and the bullet hole in the roof. In the confusion that followed, Jake moved with the silent efficiency of someone who knew every inch of his own home. Clara heard the sound of a brief struggle, Morrison's cry of alarm, and then Jake's voice, calm and authoritative. It's over, Morrison. Drop the rifle. When Jake managed to relight the lamp, Clara saw that Morrison was on the ground, Jake's knee pressed against his back, and his own rifle now pointed at the federal detective's head. You can't kill me, Sterling, Morrison gasped. I'm a federal officer. Kill me, and you'll have the entire government hunting you. I'm not going to kill you, Jake replied quietly. I'm going to do something worse. I'm going to save your life and make you live with it. Over the next hour working together despite Morrison's threats and protests, Jake and Clara managed to secure the broken window and stabilize the cabin's temperature. Morrison, disarmed and tied securely to a chair, was forced to watch as his intended victims worked to ensure all three of them survived the storm. Why? Morrison demanded as Jake shared his own food and water with the man who'd come to kill him. Why save me when I came here to destroy you? Jake looked at the broken man who'd spent 3 years consumed by hatred and revenge. Because David wouldn't want his death to turn his brother into a killer. Because someone has to break the cycle of violence. And because Clara taught me that the best revenge against hatred is refusing to let it make you less than human. The storm raged for 3 more days, trapping Jake, Clara, and Samuel Morrison together in the mountain cabin like reluctant partners in an experiment of survival and redemption. During those long hours, something fundamental shifted between captor and captives as the reality of their shared humanity overcame the abstractions of justice and revenge. Morrison's transformation began on the second day when fever set in from his exposure to the blizzard. The federal detective, who'd seemed so dangerous and implacable, became just another sick man needing care to survive the mountain winter. His temperature's too high, Clara reported as she checked Morrison's condition. Despite everything he'd done, her teacher's instincts and basic human decency wouldn't let her watch him suffer needlessly. Jake looked up from the medical supplies he was preparing. Pneumonia, probably. Common enough when someone gets chilled and exhausted. He'll die without proper treatment. Morrison, conscious but weak, managed a bitter laugh. Would solve your problems, wouldn't it, Sterling? Let the fever take me, and there's no one left to testify about your crimes. Maybe, Jake replied quietly, preparing a dose of willow bark tea. But that's not who I want to be anymore. Over the next day and night, Jake and Clara took turns nursing Morrison through his fever, sharing their food and medicine with the man who'd come to destroy them. Clara read to him from Jake's collection of books during his delirious periods, while Jake monitored his breathing and adjusted the cabin's temperature to aid his recovery. Why? Morrison asked on the third day when his fever finally broke and rational thought returned. Why save someone who was trying to kill you? Clara, who was preparing a broth to help rebuild Morrison's strength, answered without looking up from her work. Because that's what decent people do. We take care of each other, even when we have good reasons not to. Morrison studied her face, seeing something there that his 3 years of obsessive hatred had blinded him to. You really didn't know about his past when you married him, did you? Actually, I did, Clara replied calmly. I discovered the truth several weeks ago. Morrison's eyes sharpened with renewed suspicion. Then why did you stay? Why protect a criminal? Clara set down her wooden spoon and looked directly at the federal detective. Because I learned the difference between the man Jake used to be and the man he's become. Because I chose to judge him by his actions toward me rather than his actions before he met me. He killed my brother. No, Clara said firmly. You told us your brother drew his gun first during a struggle. That makes it self-defense, not murder. The fact that you've spent 3 years telling yourself otherwise doesn't change the truth. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, processing Clara's words. When he spoke again, his voice carried less certainty than it had since his arrival. David was trying to prove himself. He was young, inexperienced, probably scared. Maybe he did draw first because he panicked. Jake looked up from the fire he was tending. I've wondered about that for 3 years, Morrison. I've carried the guilt of your brother's death every day since it happened. But Clara's right. It was self-defense, not murder. Then why did you run? Because I was guilty of 17 train robberies and $50,000 in theft. Because I knew that self-defense wouldn't matter if I was caught red-handed with stolen gold. Jake's voice carried 3 years of regret. And because I was young and scared too, just like David. The fourth day brought clear skies and the beginning of Morrison's physical recovery. More importantly, it brought a conversation that would change all their futures. Sterling, Morrison said as they shared breakfast in the peaceful aftermath of the storm. I need to know something. Do you still have the gold you stole? Jake exchanged a glance with Clara before answering. Most of it. I spent some on supplies in this cabin, but probably $40,000 is still hidden in the mountains. And you'd be willing to return it? I'd be willing to do more than return it, Jake replied carefully. I'd be willing to face trial for my crimes if certain conditions could be met. Morrison leaned forward, his professional instincts overcoming his personal vendetta for the first time in 3 years. What kind of conditions? Immunity for Clara. She's not an accomplice. She's a victim of circumstances who happened to fall in love with the wrong man. Full immunity in writing before I surrender. Clara felt her heart skip at Jake's casual reference to love, the first time either of them had spoken the word aloud. What else? Morrison asked. Recognition that David's death was self-defense during the commission of a felony, not premeditated murder. I'll plead guilty to the robberies, but I won't confess to murdering your brother when that's not what happened. Morrison was quiet for several minutes, his trained mind working through the legal and practical implications of Jake's offer. You're asking me to give up 3 years of believing you murdered David in cold blood. I'm asking you to accept the truth instead of the story you've been telling yourself, Clara said gently. Your brother died in a tragic accident during a robbery attempt. That's terrible, but it's not the same as murder. My family still fell apart. My parents still died from grief. And that's a tragedy too, Jake said quietly. But destroying my life won't bring them back. It won't heal your pain or honor David's memory. Morrison stared out the cabin window at the snow-covered peaks that had witnessed his obsessive pursuit coming to such an unexpected end. What makes you think I have the authority to negotiate immunity deals? Because you're Samuel Morrison, senior federal detective with the Union Pacific Railroad Investigation Division, Clara said, surprising both men with her knowledge. Because your word carries weight with territorial judges and federal prosecutors, and because you're tired of being consumed by hatred. Morrison looked at Clara with newfound respect. You've done your research. I'm a teacher. Research is what I do. Over the following week, as Morrison regained his strength and the mountain trails became passable again, they worked out the details of an agreement that would satisfy justice while allowing mercy to temper revenge. Jake would surrender himself to federal authorities and return the stolen gold. In exchange, Morrison would testify that David's death was accidental self-defense, that Clara was an innocent victim who deserved immunity, and that Jake's cooperation merited consideration for a reduced sentence. One more thing, Morrison said on the morning he was scheduled to ride back to Pine Ridge. I want to understand something. What made you change, Sterling? 3 years ago, you were angry enough to rob trains. Now you're willing to sacrifice yourself to protect your wife. What happened? Jake looked at Clara, who was preparing their breakfast with the efficient competence she'd developed during their months together. I learned the difference between running from my past and building a future. Clara taught me that you can't find happiness by destroying other people, even people who deserve it. Morrison nodded slowly, understanding something about his own journey as well as Jake's. Maybe it's time I learned that lesson too. The legal proceedings that followed Morrison's return to civilization took nearly 3 months. During that time, Jake and Clara remained in their mountain cabin, waiting to learn whether Jake's surrender would result in a federal prison sentence or something more merciful. The answer came with the spring thaw, delivered by Morrison himself along with territorial judge William Harrison. Jacob Sterling, Judge Harrison announced formally as they gathered in the cabin's main room. By the authority of the Colorado Territorial Court, and with the recommendation of Federal Detective Samuel Morrison, you are hereby sentenced to 5 years of supervised probation and community service, to be served in the Colorado Territory under the supervision of territorial law enforcement. Clara felt tears of relief burning her eyes as Jake's face showed amazement at the unexpected mercy. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, in recognition of your cooperation in returning stolen property and your demonstrated rehabilitation, you are hereby appointed as Deputy Territorial Marshal for the High Country District, with authority to maintain law and order in the remote settlements and mining camps of the Colorado Mountains. Jake stared at the badge Morrison held out to him. You're making me a lawman? The territory needs men who understand both sides of the law, Morrison replied with something that might have been a smile. Men who've made mistakes and learned from them. Men who know these mountains and can keep the peace here. "And Clara?" Jake asked. Judge Harrison turned to Clara with formal courtesy. "Mrs. Sterling, the Territorial Education Board has authorized you to establish a school for the children of the mountain settlements. Your salary will be provided by territorial funds, and you'll have the authority to travel between communities as educational needs require." Clara felt a surge of joy at the prospect of returning to teaching, of using her education to help build something meaningful in the Colorado Territory. That evening, after their official visitors had departed for Pine Ridge, Jake and Clara sat together on their cabin porch, watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of golden rose. "Mrs. Sterling," Jake said, testing the sound of Clara's married name combined with his real surname. "I like the sound of that," Clara replied, leaning against his shoulder. "It feels more honest than Mrs. Steele." "Clara," Jake said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have mentioned weeks ago." Clara felt a familiar flutter of concern. "What kind of something?" Jake's smile was nervous but genuine. "I've been watching you for signs, and I think, that is, I believe you might be carrying our child." Clara's breath caught as Jake's observation confirmed her own growing suspicion. "How long have you known?" "About 2 weeks. I didn't want to say anything until I was certain, and until we knew what my legal situation would be." Jake's hand found hers, warm and steady. "Are you happy about it?" Clara thought about everything they'd been through together, everything they'd built and survived and learned about each other. "I'm terrified and thrilled and grateful all at the same time." "That sounds about right for becoming parents in the Colorado Territory," Jake said with a laugh. As darkness fell over their mountain valley, Clara reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. The abandoned bride who'd stood on those church steps in Pine Ridge felt like a different person entirely from the woman who now sat beside her husband, planning their future as educators and law enforcement in the territorial government. "Jake," she said softly, "do you ever regret that night when you rode into Pine Ridge and found me on those church steps?" Jake pulled her closer, his voice warm with contentment and certainty. "Not for a single second. You saved my life, Clara, just as much as I saved yours." Outside their warm cabin, the Colorado mountains stretched away under a canopy of stars, holding the promise of new challenges and new adventures for the former train robber and the abandoned bride who'd found their destiny in each other's arms. Their love story had begun with desperate circumstances and hasty vows, but it had grown into something strong enough to survive the worst that both nature and human nature could throw at them. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities, new students to teach, and new communities to protect. But tonight, in the sanctuary they'd built together from nothing but hope and determination, Jake and Clara Sterling looked toward a future filled with the promise of family, purpose, and the kind of love that made all their struggles worthwhile. 5 years later, the sounds of children's laughter echoed across the mountain valley that Jake and Clara Sterling had transformed into the heart of Colorado's most successful high country settlement. Their son David, named in honor of the young man whose accidental death had nearly destroyed so many lives, played in the wildflower meadow with his younger sister Sarah, while Clara watched from the porch of the expanded schoolhouse that served families from 3 different mining camps. Jake rode into the clearing as the afternoon sun painted the peaks in familiar shades of gold, his deputy marshal's badge catching the light as he dismounted with the easy grace of someone completely at home in the saddle. The scared young man who'd robbed trains in misguided fury had evolved into something far more valuable, a keeper of peace who understood both sides of human nature. "How was the circuit this month?" Clara asked as Jake approached the schoolhouse steps, automatically checking him for signs of injury or trouble. "Quiet, mostly. Settled a dispute between 2 mining claims, arrested a card cheat in Copper Creek, and delivered mail to the Henderson family." Jake's smile was content and weary in equal measure. "Morrison sends his regards from Denver. He's been promoted to chief federal detective for the territory." Clara nodded, unsurprised by their former adversary's continued success. Samuel Morrison had channeled his investigative skills and relentless determination into building one of the most effective law enforcement operations in the Colorado Territory. More importantly, he'd found peace with his brother's memory and his own need for justice rather than revenge. Their children's laughter drew both parents' attention to the meadow where David was teaching Sarah how to identify edible plants, a skill Jake had taught him, just as Clara was teaching reading and arithmetic to the scattered children of the high country. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped in Pine Ridge that evening? Clara asked, settling beside Jake on the schoolhouse steps. Jake considered the question seriously, as he always did when Clara asked about their unlikely beginning. I think we would have found each other somehow. Maybe not that night, maybe not in those circumstances, but somehow. You believe in destiny? I believe in people who are brave enough to take chances on each other, Jake replied, pulling Clara closer against his side. I believe in love that grows stronger through testing rather than weaker. Clara looked out over the community they'd helped build, the school that served children from 6 different settlements, the trading post that connected isolated families to the wider world, the small church where they had renewed their wedding vows with their real names, and the blessing of people who'd become genuine friends. The abandoned bride who'd stood on those church steps in her wedding dress, watching her intended groom flee with her money, had become something she'd never imagined possible. A woman whose life mattered to an entire community, whose work shaped the future of the Colorado Territory, whose love had helped transform a bitter criminal into a force for justice. Jake, Clara said softly, watching their children play in the meadow where she'd once discovered his hidden gold. Yeah? I'm glad Roland Blackwood was a coward and a thief. Jake's laughter was rich and genuine. So am I. Best thing that bastard ever did was run away from you. As evening settled over their mountain sanctuary, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them from desperate strangers to partners in every sense of the word. Sometimes the greatest gifts came, wrapped in the most unlikely circumstances, and sometimes the love worth fighting for was the love you never saw coming. Their story had begun with betrayal and ended with trust, started with desperation and concluded with hope, commenced with 2 broken people and culminated with a family strong enough to weather any storm the mountains could send their way. Inspired by true events, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in May 1869 transformed the American West, bringing prosperity and opportunity along with crime and conflict. Many real train robbers of this era, including some who became folk heroes, ultimately sought redemption through cooperation with law enforcement. This story honors those who chose to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, and to find love in the most unexpected places. The Colorado Territory's vast wilderness provided sanctuary for countless people seeking fresh starts, while the growth of mining camps and railroad towns created opportunities for educated women to serve as teachers and community builders. Many real marriages began with desperate circumstances and grew into partnerships that helped shape the American frontier. Thank you for joining Jake and Clara on their journey from abandoned bride and hidden outlaw to respected pillars of their mountain community. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the best love stories begin with the worst possible circumstances, because true partnership isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other again and again, no matter what challenges life sends your way.